Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching this virtual lecture. Sorry it could not be posted live. We ran into some technical difficulties, but I hope you'll enjoy. This is our first video lecture of 2023, and today we're joined by Bill Sommers. Enjoy.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking today about money during the colonial period. And for me, I collect between, say, the time of Columbus to the time of the U.S. Constitution. In honor of the colonial dames, I'll stop this at the Declaration of Independence. Certainly don't have time to go through everything coin-wise over those centuries, but I'll show a few coins from my collection and why they're important to the colonial period. And let me set the stage with what was going on in colonial America and how that affected coins. First of all, England did not allow silver or gold coins to come to the colonies. Hence, even though we were English colonies, we had relatively few English silver or gold coins here. We did do our accounting in the English system of pounds, shillings, and pence, but relatively few coins of those denominations. In fact, there were no pound denominations at that time. Also, even though England did provide copper coins, they provided them in very insufficient numbers, and therefore we were always at a shortage. And as a result, that void was filled with a lot of counterfeits. Not so much counterfeits made in the colonies, but counterfeits that came from England, and not officially sanctioned from the king, of course, but certainly weren't discouraged, but counterfeits that came from entrepreneurs. And then finally, the part of the colonial system meant that England did not allow us to trade with other countries. They wanted all of us, our trade, to be beholden to them. So fortunately, or out of necessity, we ignored that rule, and we traded with other countries anyway. And so this is where most of our coins, our silver coins in particular, came from countries we traded with, primarily Spain, France, and the Netherlands. And so that was the source of the coins, and most of the coins we'll be talking about today. Just a few words about minting coins to help put things in context. Casting was a popular way, a very crude way of minting coins with a mold, either in sand or engraved in a soft metal. Very common with counterfeiters because it was relatively cheap and easy to get into that. Most of the coins of the 1600s and early 1700s would be hammered coins or struck coins, where you have a die that represents the obverse and the reverse, or the heads and tails of the coin. One die would go against an anvil, the other die would be struck with a hammer to make an imprint of the coin. A fairly slow process, about 1 coin per minute, could be made in this way, and there are some limitations that we'll talk about. And then finally, in the early part of the 1700s, the most common method became to mill the coins or machine the coins. And you've got a screw press, you've got mechanical advantage now. You can get a much more accurate, a much deeper imprint. You're basically doing the same thing that you did with a hammer, except you're using the screw press to get much higher pressures. And you can go much faster, typically about 100 per minute. These images of hammers and dies and the screw press on the bottom are all from an exhibit at the Mint at the Tower of London, the Mint exhibit at the Tower of London. The Mint's no longer there. It was moved to Tower Hill in the early 1800s. It was moved to Wales in the 1960s. But I had the fortune of visiting there this last fall, and those are some images from there. In fact, the image behind me is what they call Mint Street. It's basically between the outer wall and the inner wall, and it was a whole street where the different trades involved in numismatic type activities would have been done. So jumping into the coins, probably the most important, if you had to say what one coin was important in colonial America and really important in the world during that period, it was the 8 reales coin, or the peso, from South America, from Spanish America. This particular coin on the top here is from Potosi, which was in Peru then. Now we would call it Bolivia. But the Spanish found huge silver deposits in Central and South America, and they set up mints, and they set up mines, and they set up mints to develop these coins. That top one is a hammered coin, a very crude one. In fact, it's so crude we call it a cob. Don't even call it a coin. It was really a temporary measure to fill the ships, send it back to Spain. They would melt them down and make pretty coins. But a lot of them ended up in this form in colonial America. So it's a very important coin. In fact, these cobs were minted from 1536 all the way up to 1773. So really throughout our entire pretty much colonial period, these coins would have been available. The lower coin is the milled version of that coin. These came about starting in 1732. obviously much more of what we think of as a coin. It's got a defined shape, much more clarity, and very importantly, it has edge detail. And if you look at the, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not there, but you've got a reading around the edge here, a chevron around the edge here. One of the problems with coins of the day is that unscrupulous people would shave or clip a little bit of the silver off around the edge. You look at something like a cob at the top, who would know? The only way you would know would be to weigh it, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But with the lower coin, that would be very obvious because of the shape and because of this reading around the edge. So that was a huge improvement. This particular coin was minted in Mexico City in 1747. One of the things I'll call out here is if you look at one of the pillars, this is called a pillar dollar. These pillars represent the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea or the Strait of Gibraltar, and these pillars have a ribbon going around it, and that is one very likely source of where our symbol for our U.S. dollar would come from later in time. Another interesting connection to that is part of the Latin on the coin says "utra cu unum." Means both are one, means both worlds, the New World and the Old World, are both Spanish. And you see the two kind of globes or spheres in there representing that. It's kind of indicative of what we would put on our coins later, e pluribus unum, to say many are one, for the many colonies becoming one. These coins were so important that they were actually the basis for our U.S. coinage later. And in fact, they of themselves were legal U.S. tender all the way up until 1857. One other thing I'll mention here is this word you see here, piastre. That is actually from a document I found in New Orleans a few months ago. It was handwritten by an ancestor of mine. I know since the Dames are an ancestral organization, I'm going to bring in some of my ancestry here. That was written by one of my ancestors talking about a financial transaction, and that is the term that they used in French Louisiana to describe these pesos, these 8 reale type coins. But the Spanish coins were not limited to just the 8 reales. They were really a whole suite of coins. You had the 8 reales, you had 4, you had 2, you had 1 real, and you had a half. There was even a quarter, although it was very little used in the U.S. in the colonies. But these 5 really were, and they were the mainstay of colonial silver coinage. And so I've sort of showed those are the milled versions. Below I have a few of the different cobs. This last cob I'll call out is a half real. That actually a coin very similar to that was recently dug up in Colonial Williamsburg on one of my favorite spots in something they call it the Custis site. It's basically Martha Washington's first father-in-law, I think. So this was very similar to a coin they dug up there. So that's nice provenance. So I tried to find a coin that was similar to that for that connection. So I talked about the connection to U.S. coinage. The 2 reales coin here is very much meant to was the impetus or the incentive for our quarter, our American quarter, which I've shown there. And you see there's a lot of similar. Of course, we don't have any silver in ours anymore, but a lot of similarity in the size of that coin even today. That's where the term 2 bits, if you've ever heard a quarter called a 2-bit, basically a bit was a reale. So the 2 reales coin was referred to as a 2-bit. The half bit, I think, was called the picayune. If you ever have heard picayune, that's another slang in the colonies. Maybe that one might have come a little bit later. But these coins were the basis for the early coins in the U.S. and dominated the entire colonial American period. One thing I'll mention too is that when I give this in person, I like to pass the coins around. Unfortunately, we can't do that today, but all of the coins are to the same scale. So if you see a coin smaller or bigger, they're all to the exact same scale, so you can get a feel for how they compare. And then, of course, I put the quarter in here so you could see how that one compared as well. One other Spanish coin I want to mention was the pistarine. This one was actually minted in Spain itself, not in South America. A hugely important coin, particularly in Virginia and the surrounding colonies. General Braddock brought in huge quantities of this coin during the French and Indian War to pay for his operations. And so there are a lot of these. It's probably the most common colonial coin in Virginia, I think would be a fair statement for much of its period. The silver content was a little lower, so they were not worth, even though it's labeled as 2 reales, it's worth a little bit less, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. One other important aspect of this coin is that it was very commonly cut. Most of the ones that are dug up were cut coins. You notice it has a cross here which makes it very easy to cut accurately and confirm that it was cut accurately. So this is below that we see a coin that was cut in half, so that would be worth 1 real. At the bottom we see one that's cut into a quarter, so that would be a half real. And so these were very important ways of making change. Today it would mean nothing to cut a coin in half because the coin has no intrinsic value; it's all fiat. But then it was the silver in the coin that had the value. So you cut a coin in half, you've got a half of that value. And that was a very much accepted and standard thing. In fact, this cut in half coin was so popular in Virginia that it became the basis of the US dime, or called the dime at the time. And it was proposed by a Virginian, imagine that, named Thomas Jefferson, who was very familiar with these and thought that would be a great coin to have in the U.S. system. And since that was a dime, you can imagine that the coin below here, cut into a quarter, would have been the half dime. Wouldn't call a nickel because it's made out of silver, but it is certainly the predecessor to our nickel. So this was a very, very important coin, and very important to understand how coins were cut to facilitate making change. Leaving the Spanish for a bit, we're going to get into sort of German coins, German state type coins and other parts of Europe. This is an extremely important coin worldwide called the Thaler. It was called the Joachimsthaler. Originally, they shortened it to Thaler. It just means valley. It was named after the valley where it was first a huge silver deposit was found. Lost my place here a little bit. Got out of that. Huge silver deposit was found in Bohemia, and these coins were first minted in 1520. So actually predates some of the Spanish 8 reales coins a little bit. But these were called Thalers. They were picked up in other countries and duplicated because they were so successful. They were really the first mass-produced large silver coin, and it really changed commerce. It changed economics worldwide. These coins in one form or fashion were in use for 400 years. One of the interesting things about this coin is if you look at the lower coin I've shown here, this was the Dutch version of that. It was called a Louisdaalder. They pronounced it Daalder, and that's where eventually our term dollar came from Thaler to Daalder to dollar. So that's sort of the evolution, if you will, of that term. This was a very important coin. We had a large Dutch population in the colonies, particularly in New York and Pennsylvania. And so, in fact, New York was called New Amsterdam for a time. And this coin was very popular there. It's actually in the legislation about the values and such. It was called a lion dollar. That's the interpretation of the name because it has this kind of scruffy looking lion on the back. I'm not sure if it was endearing or deriding, but the colonists would refer to this as a dog dollar because that dog looks kind of weird, and because if you get a worn version, even more worn than this one, he starts to look even weirder. So that was how, if you hear the term dog dollar, it's hard for me to say, that's what they're referring to. Going back to the one on the top, this coin was actually minted in Pomerania. And the reason I show this one is if you look in the lower left there of this obverse where I have this highlighted, you'll often find the mint maker or the mint master or the engraver's initials on a coin. This is ILA, and that stands for Johann. They used I's for J's. Johann Leonard Arensberg. And I was real excited when I found out that Mr. Arensberg is I think my 8th great grandfather. So I actually had a great grandfather who was a minter, and he minted this coin, had his initials on this coin, and his son would come to Louisiana and be one of my first ancestors in that part of the colonies. And I'll have more to say about him a little bit later. Another very important source of coins in the colonies was France. The equivalent of a France crown or a France dollar was called the écu, and this is an example of a Louis XV écu from 1767. These were also very important coins. These were also legal tender in the United States until the mid 1800s. A lot of these would be used to finance the Revolutionary War, in fact. We'll talk more about copper coins later, but I did want to just show one, or British copper coins, but I want to show one French copper coin here. This is an 8 denier coin from 1722. It was actually minted for use in the French colonies. You can see there, it says Colonies Francois. It was minted for use in, say, Canada, Acadia, Louisiana, and the Caribbean. And one of the reasons I'm very interested in this coin is because one was found near Fort Toulouse, Alabama. And it's near Wetumpka, if you're not familiar with that. And I actually had a different seventh great grandfather who served there. And in fact, my sixth great grandfather was born there in 1726. So I was very keen about this coin, and I actually studied the one that was found, and I could determine exactly which die was used for the obverse and the reverse. And I made sure that I collected one that exactly matched that combination of dies for the obverse and reverse. That's kind of a numismatic thing to get into the subtleties of, you can tell which die was used for which coins by little idiosyncrasies, little defects, etc., in the way that they're minted and the way that they wear. And so that's not the coin that was found at Toulouse. I'd love to find that coin. I haven't done it yet, but it is a very exact match. And one of the reasons I want to talk about today is because if you haven't been to Fort Toulouse, I'd encourage you to go, because there's a nice plaque there that thanks the Alabama Society of the Colonial Dames for preserving Fort Toulouse, essentially. And that plaque, that monument went up in 1912, commemorating this French fort in 1714. So one of the early European presences in Alabama, and certainly very important to our state history and very important to my family history as well. Getting away from foreign countries, I mentioned that we weren't allowed to mint coins in the United States, in the colonies. However, Massachusetts found a loophole. The real key to printing money or minting money is that it is a royal prerogative. It's the king's right. It's the king's sideline. He makes money off making money. And so Massachusetts said, well, during the period between Charles I and Charles II, English didn't have a king. They had chopped Charles I's head off, so they didn't have a king. So Massachusetts decided that meant that they could mint their own money, and they did, and it was very successful. This is an example of what's called a pine tree shilling. It's a silver coin with a pine tree on it. You can sort of see Massachusetts around the side there, inscribed around there. They also had a willow tree series. They had an oak tree series. And these coins were minted for 30 years between 1652 and 1682, and they were used in circulation throughout New England for 200 years. Mine's kind of a weak copy. These are not easy to find or not cheap to find in better condition, so mine's fairly weak. So I've shown a better example here of the same coin, essentially, and so you can clearly read the Massachusetts. You can clearly see the 1652. You can see the 12 there for it being a shilling. Now, you'll notice over here, I've said that it's worth 9 pence. And so it's important to understand that things were worth more in the colonies, if you will, than they would be worth in England. So this coin, while we're calling it a 12-shilling coin, if you actually took this to London and said, hey, what's this worth in sterling, it would only be 9 pence. So something to keep in mind that applied throughout the colonial period. Now, eventually, Charles II came back to the throne. And so they wanted Massachusetts to stop, and Massachusetts conveniently always put the same date on these coins. Even though they minted them for 30 years, they always only put the date 1652. Maybe they were trying to say, hey, we're not minting new ones. These are just old coins that we're still using. But regardless, eventually Charles II was not going to have any more of it. And he did actually, in fact, revoke their charter over this in 1684. But these are really the only example of a coin minted in the colonies for use in the colonies. So extremely important coin that I wanted to talk about. Speaking of Charles, since we talked about Charles, I show an example here of even though these English coins wouldn't have been very prevalent in the colonies, I wanted to show some coins from there's Charles I at the top. This is a half crown, and you notice he's on horseback. If you use a little imagination there, very unusual to have the king on a horseback for a coin. After Charles II was reinstalled to the throne, this is an example of a crown from Charles II. And then I thought I'd use this as an opportunity to show a coin from Charles III. So this is the first coin, the first circulating coin for their new King Charles III. This is a 50p coin, 50 pence. They're no longer used the D for denarii. They use p since they went decimal in 1971, and a pound went from 240 pence, which it would have been in the colonial period, to 100 pence, which it is in the modern time. A couple of things you'll notice about this. One thing you'll notice that Charles III is facing different than Charles II, and that's tradition. The monarch will always face the opposite direction from their predecessor. So Queen Elizabeth faced to the right, which means Charles III faces to the left. So that's one example of tradition that they've preserved. But there's a lot of things that are different, right? You'll notice that Charles, the name Charles in the other coins from Charles I and II is in Latin, whereas Charles III decided to stick with English to be more relatable, more approachable. However, he does still have some Latin vestiges in there. He's got this DG for Di Gratia, which means by the grace of God. Also this FD, which is Latin for defender of the faith. So he did keep some vestiges there of the past. You notice it's not round coin. It is a heptagon to make it easier to distinguish from the round. They have some round coins that are not too different in size, so that helps distinguish that. One thing I really like is that they've sort of preserved on the obverse some of the iconography of the past. What this is representing here are the four empires, if you will, under Charles II. You've got the heart for Ireland. You've got the rampant lion for Scotland. You've got the passant lion for England, and you've got the fleur-de-lis for France. Now, King Charles III no longer claims France, but he does have four. It might be hard to see there, but he does have the heart for Ireland. He's got the lions for Scotland and England, and he's got trying to think what he's got in there for Wales. He also has, I guess because Charles is very interested in nature, he's also got the national flower for each of those entities. He's got a thistle for Scotland. He's got a rose for England. He's got a shamrock for Ireland, and he's got a leek for Wales. So some homages to the past and some things, of course, that are very different from the past. So I just thought I'd mention that. Now, one thing about all these silver coins, you've probably gotten a feel for, there's all these different countries and different denominations, and some of them have the denomination marked and some of them don't. Some of them might be shaved or clipped around the edges by counterfeiters. So how do you keep all of this straight? And the answer was that they would publish tables, and this is an example of a table from an almanac, a New York almanac, 1771, that shows for all the common coins what their weight, what their value is in sterling, what their value is in New York money, what their weight should be, what their value is in Connecticut, what their value is in Philadelphia and Quebec, and what the minimum weight before you just would say it's not even that coin anymore. So these tables were published often and frequently, and merchants had to keep up with these. You also had to have a scale if you were a merchant or involved a lot with money. This is my scale here where I'm weighing, in fact, I'm weighing that 8 reales coin that we showed before against what's called a coin weight. So this is a fiducial that's published. It's not made of silver, it's made of brass. It has no monetary value, but it's used to make sure that you've got the right weight. And you can see I had to add a little bitty square here of sheet weight to get them to balance out, which means I'm a little bit light. So if I was going to use this 8 real coin, I would probably have a pence or so deducted because of that. So you've got to have all these different weights to represent different coins and the little sheet metal to figure out what the delta is. This little square one is kind of neat. That's a coin weight called a scruple. You probably heard the term scruple before. Well, scruple means a weight. It goes back to biblical times. It was a small stone used for weighing. And of course, we're used to thinking of it as kind of like morals or ethics. And it has to do with, is that like a small stone in your shoe that, if you've done something wrong, you've got to get that out. You've got to correct your mistake before you go on. So, or it's a weight. It's something that's weighing on you until you come clean, so to speak. So these coin weights were very important. Some of them have dates because weights of coin would change with dates. So some of these weights might say this is for use before 1771 or use after 1771. Very important for gold coins. Since gold coins had so much value, every individual grain was important. Also important for silver coins, not really important much at all for copper coins, as we'll get to. And let's get to copper coins. So to start at the beginning, a frequent question you might think about or get asked is, well, what's the first colonial coin? And there's a couple ways to look at this. And so the oldest colonial coin I have is on the top here. It's called a blanca. It's a Spanish coin. It's minted around the time that Columbus made his voyage in 1492. It's a material called billon, which is basically a copper coin. It's got a little bit of silver mixed in, but not a lot. This was actually a coin of Ferdinand and Isabella. It has an F on one side for Ferdinand. It has a Y on the other side, which I think is kind of neat for Isabella, the monarchs who sent him on his voyage. And these coins have actually been found in the Americas, not to my knowledge in North America, but they were found in a community called La Isabela, which was founded by Columbus in 1492. That's the first European town in the Americas. I don't think it's continuously inhabited. That honor would go to a town he founded in 1496 called Santo Domingo. And this lower coin, which can really make a better case for being the oldest or the first colonial coin, was minted in Santo Domingo for use there. It certainly did find its way into North America. These were found at Jamestown. These were found at St. Augustine. In fact, this was probably minted in the 1550s, not long before St. Augustine was founded. By the way, Jamestown is a great source. They've had a lot of archaeology going on there for the past couple of decades, a lot of fantastic coin finds, and I've tried to duplicate a few of those in my collection. Let's see, I think that's all I want to say about that. The bulk, however, of copper coins in the colonies did come from England. And I've shown just a few examples. These were used in the colonies throughout the entire colonial period, but I picked just a few here that I wanted to highlight. This first one I like because it has William and Mary. It has both monarchs. They co-ruled both monarchs on the coin. That's very unusual and very neat to me. My parents are named William and Mary, so that's kind of a neat connection there. If you compare that to a U.S. penny, I've kind of shown that on here for reference. This is a half penny. However, the half penny was really the primary copper coin used in the colonies. Pennies were almost not heard of in conventional form. Farthings there were a number of farthings that are found here and used here, but the half penny was really the workhorse coin for low denominations. The second one is interesting. This is called the Rosa Americana, and if you could read that a little clearer in red there, it actually says Rosa Americana. So it's the first coin to say America. It was minted with George I's permission. He gave a patent to one of his subjects who minted those and tried to make money by sending those to the colonies. However, that didn't go very well because he tried to make more money than he should have by pawning this off as a penny. And you can see that his penny was significantly smaller than a royal half penny. And the colonists were no dummies, so they really rejected this coin. When it did trade, it traded as a half penny. It did not trade as a full penny. And then the coin on the bottom is a very interesting coin. This was a royal coin minted specifically for the colonies, probably the only such, and it actually was minted for Virginia. If you read in red there, you've got the VIA on one side, VIR on one. Oh no, I guess you've got the Virg on one side, and then you've got the Ninia on the other side. So this was minted by George III. Virginia had been asking for copper coinage for decades, and George III finally delivered in 1774. And by the time it went through the red tape and started getting distributed to the colonists, it was 1775, literally just a couple of months before Lexington and Concord. So unfortunately, this was a good example of too little, too late. But these coins are very common in Virginia. They find a lot of them in Virginia. They find a lot of them at Williamsburg. So very, very important and very unique coin. I talked about counterfeits. It's estimated that by the time of the Revolution or just before the Revolution, 2/3 of the copper coins in the colonies were counterfeit. But to some extent, we didn't really care. We just used them because we had to use something. And so as long as everybody accepted this as tender, accepted this for exchange, it sort of worked. If you look at on the left here, that top coin is a half penny of George II. On the bottom is a cast counterfeit. We talked about casting. This was probably a crude sand cast. You can see the two little ports where the molten copper would have been poured in. These coins obviously look very crude, very weak. They're lighter, they're thinner. They're not really going to fool anybody. They did try to backdate them to make them look like old coins and that sort of thing, but they were pretty easy to spot. On the right is a copper half penny of George III. And this is actually a milled coin, so better quality. But you can still tell that that's not quite up to par with the Regal coin. Plus, they did have some quirks in here. Everyone has its own little identity. If you look in red here, the neck on Britannia seems to be a little too long. So numismaticists have nicknamed this coin the olive oil coin. If you remember the Popeye cartoons, that's where that moniker comes from. You'll notice an example here of the monarch shifting directions. So George II faced to the left, which means George III would have faced to the right. It's hard to say what something back then would be worth now, but I'm going to take a crack at it anyway, and take those coins that I just showed here in the center here and talk about, well, how did that compare to people's wages? If you look at a common laborer, they probably had a wage of maybe 10 to 15 pence per day. If you look at a skilled tradesman or a soldier, depending on his rank, he might have earned 30 or so pennies a day. A surveyor or an officer or a barrister might have made as much as 100 pence a day. And so he might have earned one of these coins, one of these nice silver coins a day. The others might have earned one of these smaller silver coins or a collection of copper coins a day. Another way to look at it is, what did things cost back then? Well, a loaf of bread worth, a pound of bread would have cost a couple of pence. A pint of ale might have cost 3 pence. You could get a yard of coarse linen for maybe 10 pence. Shoes might have been 50 pence. And then a dozen very nice beeswax candles might have been 80 pence. So just kind of put into sense a little bit of a relative value for some of these coins. Let's switch over now to paper money. Paper money was not outlawed by England. It was not exactly encouraged, but it was not outlawed. So the colonies jumped on that. Actually, if you want to talk about North America, it was actually the first paper money was done in Canada. It was actually, it's called playing card money. They had the only source of readily available durable paper that they had on hand were playing cards. So they cut them up, and the officers would initial and seal those. And then that was sort of an IOU for money when the coins would come on the next shipment from France. So they actually sort of started it, but Massachusetts really glommed onto that in a big way, starting in 1690, and started printing this money. That's the first on the left there. This is not mine. There's only probably a half a dozen of these in the world that are known. So this is a very expensive bill, but that's an example of the first paper money in the colonies from Massachusetts in December of 1690. On the right is one that was made just a few months later in February of 1690. The year started in March, by the way, back then instead of January. So we were still in 1690. And even though only 3 months had gone by, we already see our first forgery. This was meant to be a 2 shilling or a 2 shilling 6 pence note. And you can see someone has come in here and modified the text to make it a 20 shilling bill. So it didn't take long. And we'll see that counterfeiting, just like with coins, counterfeiting was a big deal with paper money from the very get-go. All the other colonies would eventually print their own money. Virginia was last, probably starting around 1755, but they did have something equivalent to that much earlier in what they call tobacco certificates. Essentially, you would bring your hogsheads of tobacco to the warehouse, and they would give you what was essentially a receipt for that, and you would use that as money. You would use that as kind of like a check for buying things or bartering for things from other merchants. But really, the American colonies were the proving ground for paper money. Everyone was watching to see how this experiment worked. Because of our shortage of coins, we really embraced it. We really made it work. There were a few times where we would get into issues with inflation or whatever, and England would reel us in, and we would resist that and eventually correct it. It really got bad in the 1760s when England really clamped down on our colonial money, paper money, and I really think that was one of the key factors that planted the seeds for the rebellion that would follow. Getting into some other paper money, these are some more obtainable from my collection. This top one is a nice bill from 1760 Pennsylvania. The reason I was interested in this bill is because it was printed by Ben Franklin. He was a prominent printer in Philadelphia. He printed a lot of money, Pennsylvania money. He also printed some Delaware money, probably some Continental Congress money later as well. He was very preoccupied with counterfeits, as well he should have been. He invented a number of things to help with that. These leaves on the back are what they call nature prints. He thought that would be hard for an engraver to duplicate an individual leaf. And so that was one of his inventions. In fact, not too many years ago, they found one of the printing blocks that he used for that, for a different bill than this one, but they found one of those, and that's now in the collection of the the Library Company of Philadelphia, which coincidentally, Ben Franklin formed. He also did things like print with multiple colors. He had these interesting borders. Sometimes he would print things in Hebrew to throw off the forgers. He purposely misspelled Pennsylvania over here. Just went to a lot of trouble, but you could never win. The counterfeiters were able to respond to just about everything. One other thing they did for counterfeiting is they numbered each bill individually, and they had multiple people individually sign each bill. And so it's kind of fun to track these signatures down on these bills. This one is kind of neat because it was signed by Charles Thompson. He was the secretary of the Continental Congress for pretty much its entire history. And he also did some other things. I think he designed the Great Seal. He's got some other prominent features in early American history. The bottom bill is from Maryland, 1767. One of the cool things about this is it's the first bill to say dollar. Now, they're not referring to US dollars. This is way before the US. They're referring to Spanish dollars, but still the first bill with dollar on them. It highlights the fact that these Spanish dollars were so important to the colonial economy. It's also got, of course, it's got the 9 shillings, so it's relating it back to the English system. But really the dollar is the key for that. This bill was printed by Jonas Green, who was a protege of Ben Franklin's. He printed money. He printed the Maryland Gazette, which would be very, very important during the Revolutionary period for communicating with the people. Unfortunately, Jonas died literally just weeks probably after this bill was printed. His wife, Anne, took over the business and ran that business successfully for 8 years while raising their 14 children. So kudos to Anne. And in fact, if you see here, the Latin seal or the Latin inscription under the Maryland seal here means increase and multiply. So hats off to Anne. She and Jonas certainly did their part along those lines. These bills, it took me a while to get into the bills. After I started with coins, they look kind of crude and cartoonish to me, but now I find them very endearing. And the paper is really amazing. It's this rag paper or laid paper, so it's actually made from old linen clothes. And so it's very durable, and so it's why it's survived all this time. And it's just really impressive that these pieces of paper that you can see they were folded and used and stored in someone's pocket, and they're coming on 300 years old and they're still here. It's amazing. I'm going to talk a little bit about some French paper money. This bill up here was never in the colonies. It's one of the first French paper money examples. It was never in the colonies, but it was extremely important to Louisiana. What happened is the French economic minister, among other things, John Law, who was from Scotland, ironically, he had purview over their bank as well as their what's called the Company for Louisiana. So imagine this akin to the Bank of England and the West Indies Company or the East India Company of England. And so he tied these two together, and to help increase the value, he really promoted Louisiana as the next great thing. He sold it as having huge supplies of silver and gold, of being a utopia, of being just a real fantastic place to invest. And so he oversold this. If you've been to Louisiana or you're familiar with Louisiana and Mississippi, you know there's no gold or silver there. But he would hire miners to pretend that they had just come back and were talking about how much gold and silver they had mined. As you can imagine, this led to wild speculation, inflation, overhype, and a bubble that eventually burst. But before it burst, he actually took some of that money. John Law took some of that money, and he did send a lot of colonists. He sent soldiers. He sent supplies to Louisiana. He founded New Orleans in 1718 as a result, and he was trying to populate Louisiana. So he did help to start that population, because very few people were there when he got started. One sort of, and by the way, I had several of my relatives. The reason this is near and dear to me, I had several relatives who went to Louisiana because of that. I mentioned earlier the soldier at Fort Toulouse was related to the Company of Louisiana. I had a German ancestor who was the son of the engraver, who was sent here with a group of Germans to help populate the area just upriver from New Orleans. And so still called the German coast for that reason. On a darker side, one of my great grandmothers, my seventh great grandmother, sort of came here against her will, or I think she might have not been totally against her will, but a lot of her fellow women were sort of exiled against their will to the colonies to provide wives, to help the men, settle down in Louisiana, to help increase the population. And so homeless women, or women who had some issue with the law, or were just whatever reason, didn't have strong family connections to be their proponents, were literally shackled and shipped off to Louisiana to become wives. And so one of those was my seventh great grandmother, who married this soldier in Mobile. And there's a neat book about this. There's several books probably, but a neat recent book on this called Mutinous Women, how French convicts became the founding mothers of the Gulf Coast. And I actually had not read this book until I sat in on a lecture by its author. And she actually started talking about my great-great-great-grandmother, and I didn't know that connection. So that was fascinating. I've set up started a dialogue with the author since then, kind of a fascinating story. And I was able, when I was in New Orleans a few months ago, I was also able to find a document where she had hand-signed. She was literate, that she had signed when she moved to New Orleans after her first husband died. Her name was Jean Mahou. And so it was a thrill for me to actually hold a document that she had signed. So I highly recommend that book, or looking up one of Joan Dijon's lectures that are available on YouTube. Now, we talked about coins. We talked about paper money. There were other means of exchange. Obviously, barter would have been used. It's not much I can talk about barter, but barter would have probably been more common than anything in the early days. There was also something called commodity money or country money, which kind of is related to the tobacco stuff that I talked about, where you get a receipt for your goods and you can trade that receipt for other goods that you might need. So at different times, just about any crop you can imagine would have been treated as money. Furs and skins were a very prominent source. In fact, the term buck, there's different speculation about where the term buck came from, but one was that was a unit of exchange. A deer skin essentially was the predecessor of using the term buck for money. So a lot of different things were used for that. The problem is that the value can really fluctuate. And in fact, tobacco is a great example. When they first started doing tobacco money in 1612, tobacco was 60 pence per pound. But everybody said, whoa, this is great. Let's start growing tobacco. And it got over cultivated. And so by 1665, it was down to 1 penny per pound. And they were literally paying people to not grow tobacco, or they were burning tobacco to drive the price up. So it just became a real mess. Other sources of other types of exchange. One is, you probably heard the term 10 penny nails. Well, that meant 100 of those nails would be valued at 10 pennies, 10 pence. Musket balls, large musket balls, were valued at a farthing. So a lot of different commodities that could be used in exchange. One of the neater sources of exchange, or interesting sources of exchange in the colonies, was something called wampum. This was used by the natives. It was not actually used as money. I think the colonists might have misinterpreted that or misappropriated that. They used it as gifts, or they used it as a sign of authority. They would present this to show that they were the chief, or that they had the power to negotiate with other tribes, etc. But these were essentially seashell beads that were carefully cleaned and hollowed out and strung into various forms of beadwork or necklaces. And they were legal tender, particularly in the Northeast. They were legal tender up to a shilling in Massachusetts, all the way up until 1637. And they even had different denominations: the dark beads, 3 dark beads per penny per pence, or 6 light beads per pence, the blue being the dark and the white being the light. And then you could have things called fathoms, which were these huge strands, much bigger than mine here, that were several feet long, that could be worth up to 60 pence. Now, these that I show here, the one single guy there is, I think that is a period, an 18th century or 17th century bead, wampum bead. The white is wampum beads strung together. It's a modern. It's still using the seashells, but it's a modernly made. And the blue and white one is modernly made, and that's actually made of glass. And so eventually the Europeans got so efficient at better tools and processes for making this, and they came up with the glass alternative. So really it became unusable by the 1660s. for money. Another source of exchange was something called a bill of exchange. And this was extremely important, particularly for your more wealthier colonists, particularly those doing trade with England. You didn't want to be sending silver back and forth. So these were, I liken these to a cashier's check. Essentially, someone, a plantation owner might sell his goods, his crop to someone in England. He would get credit for that, and that would be documented in these bills of exchange. And then he could give these bills of exchange to other merchants, say a watchmaker, for example, in London, if he wanted a watch, or to a milliner to get clothing, etc. So these could be used as a form of checks, if you will. They were primarily for people that were well-to-do, the gentleman class, the gentry class, people who pretty much had good reputations. And the values it was a rather complex economic model, however. They factored in the time value of money for stuff to get to England, for these checks, for these bills of exchange to be used. It accounted for the different exchange rates between the colonies and England. It accounted for the credibility, if you will, of the various parties involved. So it was very sophisticated and an important system. And it wasn't just used by the colonies in England. This was a worldwide thing. Very important means of exchange and trade. So I'll close by coming back full circle to coins and talking about, how I like it when I like to handle the coins and like I said, I like to pass them around when I give this lecture in person. But I also like to find other uses for them. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to go a little forward here. I'm going to cheat a little bit, go to a Victorian poem, something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue. And I'll ask you in extension, who knows the next line? And the next line is actually, and a silver sixpence in his shoe. And so I actually have loaned, and so we get the borrowed thing as well. I've loaned one of my silver sixpence for all of my family weddings. I think there's been 4 or 5 of them over the last few years. And the bride has had this coin taped in her shoe for each of those weddings. And one of the things I like about this coin, it's dated 1607. It's a James coin. So in fact, I credit my wife with this. I was blissfully collecting coins from the mid 1700s, and she just blew my mind one day and said, well, wouldn't it be cool to have a coin dated 1607, since that's when Jamestown was founded? And I'm like, well, oh goodness, now I've got to go back 100 years and look at coins. But this is a cool coin because it is James the first coin. It is from 1607. And the Latin inscription on the obverse basically says, what God has joined, let no man separate. How cool is that for a wedding, right? Now, James wasn't thinking about my nieces and nephews' weddings. He was thinking about Scotland and England. He had been the king of Scotland before he became the king of England. So what he had in mind is let no one separate Scotland and England. But hey, it works great for weddings too. So I'm glad to see my coins still have use today. And with that, I will close.
Well, thank you for joining us tonight. I do have one question. So throughout this, you've related a lot of these coins back to your own ancestry. Is that something that just naturally happened as you were researching these coins? Did you ever have a moment where you were like, oh wow, what do you know, I'm related to this guy? Or did your ancestry kind of inform your research into these coins?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And as a member of the SAR, I'm very interested in the whole ancestry, the genealogical part of it as well. And so I was doing coin numismatic research and genealogical research kind of at the same time. In some cases, like where I would find documents and my ancestors just happened to mention a coin or a monetary value, well, that just came out of the blue. And whenever I saw that, so I would know what those words meant, and it was just, outstanding to do that. The relative the ancestor who was an engraver, that came totally out of the blue. And that was a eureka moment when I came across that. He was much earlier than, most of my genealogical research went back to the early, to the Revolutionary War period. But I decided to go back even further than that. And that's where I came across him. And that just blew my mind. So yeah, that was not anticipated at all. And I was like, oh, I have to get this coin.
Wow, absolutely amazing that that's just something you find while researching. but yeah, fantastic lecture. Thank you so much for joining us. Sorry it couldn't have been live. Um, I wish it would have. I bet we would have gotten uh, so many more questions. But thank you for your time today.
Well, and if people want to put questions onto the YouTube, if you want to send me the link to that or whatever, I'll be glad to try to answer those.
Okay, that would be awesome. All right then. Thank you everybody who watched. Have a good day.